Welcome, everyone. My name is the Reverend Peter Cook. I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Council of Churches. And we welcome you to the Council's Ecumenical and Interfaith Advocacy Day. We're so happy that so many of you can join us from around the state of New York. Today, we are here to learn a lot about the state legislative landscape, to reflect on these matters through a theological and anti-racist lens, and then center on a few topics which are of particular interest to you and your community as you discern how you can act on your faith and principles no matter your religious tradition, in the public square. This is a big day with a lot of content, so you should feel free to step away from the computer from time to time, and if you miss a little bit here and there, it will all be recorded. We hope, however, you can devote as much time and attention to what is presented here today in hopes that it will enrich your life and your ministry. We also want to thank our sponsors today, our lead sponsor, Housing Works Incorporated, and also the Reverend Dr. Charles B. Grimm, the Reverend Jim Ketchum, Sister Danielle Bonetti, Sister Catherine Darcy, the Greater Rochester Community of Churches, New Yorkers for Fiscal Fairness, the Creation Care Committee of the First Reformed Church of Schenectady, and Wantagh Memorial Congregational Church. We thank you so much for your sponsorships. Great. One other thing I would just say is on our website, www.nyscoc.org. You will find our legislative ask for the day, and you can just go on the site and pull that up. We will also put the link to the site in the chat. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our president of the New York State Council of Churches, Gary Van Kennan, who will share with us an opening prayer.
Good morning. Thank you, Peter. Will you pray with me? Lord, we come before you today after much prayer and study, seeking your wisdom as we go about the work that you have called us to. Lord, as you spoke to Zechariah, we seek true justice. We seek mercy. And we seek compassion. And we seek to extinguish oppression in this world, but today in particularly, we seek to influence the legislative agenda of New York State Legislature. And Lord, we ask your favor upon the work that we do, upon the New York State Council of Churches and all of the churches and people represented. As we join together, let us remember the words from the book of Amos. Let justice roll. In the name of Jesus, I pray it. Amen.
Thank you, Gary. So we are very pleased that the Honorable Kathy Hochul, Governor of the state of New York, will speak to us today. Steeped in Roman Catholic social justice teaching, I find it refreshing to have a governor who understands the importance of activism from faith leaders. We appreciate the effort she puts into building relationships with the faith community. For example, it was a pleasure to be with her, along with a few others of us, as we witnessed her signing the Less is More bill last September, which prevents people from being reincarcerated for technical violations while on parole. While some of us may differ with some of what the governor proposes or what she does not propose, we are very pleased that she's doing her best to take our state in the right direction to help us be a more just New York. We are thankful for her kindness and also grateful that her door is open to us. As Governor Hochul said to us in a note, she was honored that we thought of her for this important occasion and appreciated hearing from us and thanked us for this invitation. So, Governor Hochul.
Hi, I'm Governor Kathy Hochul, and I want to thank the New York State Council of Churches for the opportunity to speak to you today. And today is, of course, Advocacy Day. So I want to start by thanking all of you, our clergy, for your steadfast leadership, particularly during this pandemic. Because, as you know, you are the state's best advocates in every sense of the word. Throughout the past 2 years, you've been on the front lines in your communities, supporting your congregations, and providing much-needed spiritual guidance. But you've also helped us get people vaccinated and encourage them to wear masks and make responsible decisions necessary to save lives. You stepped up for your congregants and fellow New Yorkers when they needed you the most. This council has also long championed important policies that have the power to mend the cracks in our society that have been allowed to fester and grow for far too long. You never stop fighting for the people who feel left behind or ignored, and you work tirelessly to lift them up and push them forward. This is truly God's work here on earth, and it's very familiar to me. Growing up in a social justice Catholic family, I was taught that we serve Christ through serving others. That idea didn't sit with me or my family on Sundays. We took it with ourselves 7 days a week. I was hardwired as a child that our life's mission is to help God's people, the way Christ taught us. That sense of faith keeps me going every single day, and it continues to guide me as your governor. And that's why in my State of the State address, I proposed a whole new era for New York. I said we'd create a better, fairer version of the American dream. Let's call it the New York dream, one that provides every New Yorker an equal shot at success. My bold vision for New York includes more affordable housing and support for the homeless, much-needed reforms to our criminal justice system, historic investments in our healthcare system, boosting education, and measures to confront the gun violence epidemic head-on. But to bring about this lasting change, I need your help. There is no stronger coalition than clergy and government working together. This past Sunday, when I spoke at a Baptist church in Buffalo, I said that I needed the church and the clergy with me to combat gun violence and many more issues impacting our communities. If we stand shoulder to shoulder, we can transform our state and make that New York dream a reality, and ensure that everyone, no matter their background, race, creed, ethnicity, or socioeconomic background, can all succeed right here. And thank you again for all you do and for the opportunity to speak with you today. May God bless you all.
Thank you, Governor. And now it's a pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, the Reverend Dr. Q. English, who serves as the Director of the United States Department of Health and Human Services Partnership Center. Prior to Reverend English receiving this fine appointment and the Biden administration, Q served as Deputy Director of Faith-Based Initiatives for the Governor's Office of Faith-Based Community Development Services, In this role, so many of us on this call and across the state came to rely on her guidance and communication with the governor's office as we sought to navigate probably the most challenging event of our lifetimes, the pandemic. Today, in her new role at Health and Human Services, Reverend English will share with us a little bit about the Partnership Center and then focus our attention on what assistance has come to New York from the federal government and how additional assistance could be of benefit to us. So, Reverend English.
Good morning, and thank you, Reverend Peter Cook and the New York State Council of Churches for all the work you do on behalf of New Yorkers. We've worked alongside one another for a long time. I'm always glad to hear about the incredible strides the council makes to improve the quality of life for New York State residents. And as Peter mentioned, I am Reverend Dr. Q English, the Director of the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Since its establishment in 2001, our center has and will continue to connect with faith and community organizations to address national public health and human service issues. My vision is to expand. I want to see us not only strengthen our partnerships, but expand, assist in increasing your capacity and helping to elevate your work and providing tools to further assist your constituents. So we're going to continue our collaborative work on addressing COVID-19 prevention and vaccine and booster promotion, strengthening child and youth well-being, improving addiction treatment and recovery, which has touched many of our congregation members on this line today, and reducing healthcare disparities. And we're going to do that with you, our partners. And let me just take a moment just to pause and say thank you for the work you have done and are doing around vaccinations and boosters and addressing hesitancy. Thank you so very much. And some of you may know, and others may not, that the Partnership Center sits within the Intergovernmental and External Affairs, it's IEA office, within the office of the Secretary Javier Becerra. And we support the priorities of the Secretary and the administration by serving as an open door for faith and community partners, including service providers. We provide support by developing educational opportunities from webinars to videos, toolkits, and collaborative gatherings that leverage the department's subject matter expertise, as well as the expertise of community leaders such as yourselves around the country. And as a result, the center continues to grow and strengthen a constituency base of national and local leaders who are effectively implementing informed strategies to strengthen their communities. And lastly, we provide support by communicating key messages, resources, grant opportunities, and awards relevant to faith and community partners. So our center's priorities this year include one, maternal health, and that is supporting the goal to reduce maternal mortality and severe morbidity and expand nationwide access and coverage for high quality maternal health services. We support CMS encouraging of states to take advantage of the American Rescue Plan's option to provide 12 months postpartum coverage to people with Medicaid and CHIP, which currently only covers 60 days. And why is this important? For one, the United States has the highest maternal mortality rate of any wealthy nation in the world. And so when we look at Medicaid and CHIP, they cover over 42% of births in the nation, nearly half of which are Black, Hispanic, or American Indian, Alaska Native individuals. And it's important to know that 1/3 of maternal deaths occur between 1 week to 1 year after childbirth. And rates are especially high among Black women and American Indian, Alaska Native individuals. So we, along with our colleagues, want to ensure that the U.S. is one of the safest country in the world for giving birth. And to translate this even further, as part of the call to action, the Department of Health and Human Services released a new report estimating that 720,000 more people would gain Medicaid postpartum coverage if states act. So we're engaging our faith community and neighborhood partners around the country on this front, providing support and connecting them to needed resources. We as a center has made this one of our key priorities. And we welcome your involvement as we're also helping and connecting houses of worship to build in a support system for expecting parents, namely support groups and or ministries within houses of worship. We welcome your participation in this. And next, we're going to expand our focus to include behavioral and mental health among youth. The mental health of children was declared a national emergency last year, and suicide is the second leading cause of death among youth. So it is a priority of our secretary. In early 2021, U.S. Emergency Department visits for suspected suicide attempts soared by nearly 51% among girls 12 to 17 and increased by nearly 4% among adolescent boys compared to the same time period in early 2019. The center is going to also help lift up and support Health and Human Services SAMHSA's efforts around the launch of the Suicide Prevention Lifeline 988. It is the counterpart to 911, scheduled for July of this year. And we want to work with you here as well as we look to create greater awareness of this tool. And our third focus area will continue to be that of substance use disorder, inclusive of overdose prevention, and lastly, reentry, as we look at the intersection of reentry and mental health. So let me now take a moment to talk more about the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and its impact on New York. In the last fiscal year 2021, HHS awarded more than $8 billion in funding to New York State through more than 130,000 grant awards. So whether that is through the Health Resources and Services Administration, HRSA, providing funding for local community health centers, or the Administration for Children and Families, providing funds for local Head Start programs, providing childcare for low-income families, these funds are making a difference for those in need within New York State. And while our center does not award funds, we want to make sure that you and community leaders know about the grant funds that are available to address needs. All of this info you can find on usaspending.gov. You can go into that system and see all the grant funds and awards going into each of your communities. And this brings me to my last point, and the importance of investments by Congress in areas of need. And for that money to be available, we need Congress to appropriate the funds. And without that appropriation, HHS can't invest more in areas of need like childcare. Investments in childcare, like those discussed in various Build Back Better proposals, would save families thousands of dollars in childcare and preschool costs and build a strong, stable, early learning system that meets the needs of families, providers, and the economy. It would also make sure that childcare workers are paid more so they don't themselves live in poverty while addressing the needs of low-income families. At the same time, childcare costs have been rising for decades. And even before COVID-19, 43% of parents with children under age 6 reported struggling to find adequate childcare. And this is a concern for all of us, and not just in New York, but around our nation. And the last point I want to make is that in the expansion of Congress appropriating funds, they'll also address areas of need like caregiving. The United States has been falling behind its economic competitors in terms of the share of prime age men and women, ages 25 to 54, participating in the labor force, in part due to care challenges. One study estimates that lack of access to family-friendly policies, such as childcare and paid parental leave, explains nearly a third of the decline in U.S. women's labor force participation relative to other OECD countries. 53 million adults are unpaid caregivers for an adult or child with disabilities. And over 60% of those caregivers work And of those, 61% reported an impact on their work. So improving caregiver wages is critical to bolstering our caregiving workforce so they can enable more Americans to re-enter the workforce, pick up more hours, or face fewer care disruptions. And lastly, Congress's appropriation of funds will address areas of need like childhood poverty. The American Rescue Plan, already in effect, expanded the child tax credit and tripled the earned income tax credit for workers without dependent children. The administration is working to ensure families take advantage of these changes, and we can do more with additional investments and commitments and preserving the tax credit beyond last year. So there are also important investments that can be made in climate change, education, paid leave, and many, many other areas. But as government, we can't invest and strengthen work in these areas without investment by Congress. So I'm going to stop here. But thank you again, Reverend Peter and New York State Council of Churches for inviting me today. So great to be with you and to hear the governor's remarks today as well. And I'm inviting all of you to reach out to us at partnerships@hhs.gov. That's partnerships@hhs.gov, so we can continue our movement together. We are here to support your work on these and so many other areas as we build back better together. God bless.
Thank you, Reverend English, for all of your work in Washington, for sharing these reflections with us as we engage in a partnership at the state with the federal government to address incredible needs in our state and in our country. Our next guest is Dr. James A. Parrott, Director of Economic and Fiscal Policy at the Center for New York City Affairs for the New School. Dr. Parrott is a top-notch economist who has become one of our best experts in knowing the state budget. He is a distinguished author and frequent commentator on public policy and economics in particular. We're just so fortunate that he agreed to speak with us as he discusses the impact of federal assistance and tax revenue on the state budget and how we might reorient our priorities as a state to make better use of our resources. We can also expect him to address the problem with wealth inequality and unemployment in our state, and what we can do together to address this continuing crisis. And so it's really my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Parrott.
Good morning. Thank you, Peter. It's really good to be with you this morning. I'd like to share with you some thoughts about what's happened to working people in New York State over the past 2 years during these COVID times, and relate that to the state budget, which I've been following for decades now. And I think I could safely say that this is the best situated state budget that I have ever seen, probably that any of us have ever seen. And it really is the occasion for New York State to decide which direction it's going to go moving forward. And hopefully that will be a direction that will lift up all New Yorkers and address, you know, the wide spectrum of needs that exist and that have been underappreciated and under-addressed in recent years. For reasons having to do both with federal COVID-19 aid and prosperous times for high-income taxpayers throughout 2021, state leaders are, for the first time in modern memory, not facing any short or long-term state budget gaps. At the same time, job dislocations in the state are worse than at any time since the Great Depression. That's not the Great Recession, that's the Great Depression of the 1930s. Absent aggressive remediating policies, which are not now on the agenda, serious economic dislocations in New York are likely to fester for years to come. We also need to recover from a decade of state budgets that prioritized forced austerity and an acceptance of extreme income inequality, the worst in the nation, and worse still because of its profoundly racial polarization. We are gathered today to recognize and urge that our leaders square these widely disparate realities as they debate and adopt a new budget for state fiscal year 2023. The $216 billion budget proposal that Governor Hochul presented a month ago is historic for a number of reasons. Tax revenue growth has been such that the financial plan shows balanced budgets for the next 5 years. She unceremoniously jettisoned her predecessor's decade-long austerity budgeting that had starved human services, higher education, and funding for local governments, including for critical purposes such as childcare services and public health preparedness. But she's also building on plans she first outlined last November to use a big chunk of extra state revenue to increase reserves to over $19 billion, equal to 15% of state operating expenses for fiscal year 2025. In addition, an enormous amount of federal COVID-19 relief is flowing through the state budget. $18 billion this year, $10 billion in the coming year, and $13 billion in the out years. These funds were intended to help repair the damage wrought by the pandemic, not for things like tax cuts. And for the first time in living memory, she also set aside $2 billion in her budget proposal for the state legislature to decide how to allocate. Now, the state legislature always wants to decide how to allocate a lot in the state budget. This is the first time a governor has actually had a line that basically said, this is for the legislature to act on. This adds up to an historic budget and an historic opportunity for New Yorkers to make budget choices as if values matter, invest in our people, and build a more equitable future. The big driver on the receipts side of the ledger are the businesses and personal income taxes generated by the state's lopsided economy. Before celebrating our good fortune on the tax side, let's look closer at how non-remote workers, who make up half of all working New Yorkers, have been faring over the past 2 years. As of December, New York had 734,000 fewer jobs than it did 2 years ago. That's 7.5% of the total. The 7.5% pandemic jobs deficit is the most severe in 80 years. This staggering job loss is more than 3 times that of the rest of the country's 2% jobs deficit. While New York City's jobs deficit is 8.8%, in the rest of the state, the downstate suburbs and upstate, it's still 6.2%. Pandemic job losses are about 3 times worse in upstate New York than in the rest of the country. The pandemic has changed the economy and it's changed workers. Many businesses and jobs are not coming back, and many others are changing in response to health concerns, worker preferences, technology, and in response to the ways that other businesses are adapting. Some industries will expand faster than they were previously and in different ways. The nature of employer demands for worker skills is changing, and workers are reassessing their employment opportunities and options on a scale we've never seen before. A lot is in flux. And yet, our labor and reemployment policy nationally and in New York essentially comes down to everything will sort itself out just fine. It's only a matter of time. That mindset is risky at the national level, For New York, it's a recipe for a prolonged and racially disparate unemployment crisis. New York's economic history and the current reality are pretty clear on that score. The pandemic's economic effects have been fundamentally lopsided. While hundreds of thousands of low-paid workers and small business owners in face-to-face service industries lost their livelihoods to protect public health, incomes have risen for the great majority of high-income earners not losing jobs. More than 7 out of every 10 jobs lost in New York have occurred among the low-paid face-to-face industries where annual wages are about 1/3 of the $153,000 average for workers in finance, tech, information, and professional services, where most workers continue to work safely and conveniently on a remote basis. Wall Street media and big tech companies are flourishing. On the other hand, those without a 4-year college degree suffered more than 2/3 of pandemic job losses. Workers ages 18 to 24 were affected disproportionately, and dislocated workers were much more likely to be workers of color. For the fourth quarter of 2021, while the state's overall unemployment rate was 6.6%, it was wildly uneven across race and ethnic groups. The unemployment rate for whites was 4.7%, but for Blacks, it was an astounding 11.8%, more than twice the rate for whites. For Latinx New Yorkers, unemployment was 8.9%. In New York City, the Black unemployment rate was 15.2%. And for workers ages 18 to 24, it was nearly 24%. The division of the budget projects that New York State will not reach its pre-pandemic employment level until 2024. New York City's independent budget office projects that the city will not return to its pre-pandemic jobs level until late 2025. That would consign low-income workers, workers of color, and young workers to unemployment rates in double digits for at least another 2 to 4 years. Following the past 3 most recent economic downturns, New York City's Black and Latinx workers endured several years of double-digit unemployment rates. Our good fortune on the tax front is a stark manifestation of an unbalanced and polarized economy, an economy that became more polarized as a result of the pandemic. This is on top of the sharp disparities by race in the health impact of the coronavirus. While the bottom literally fell out of the market for face-to-face service workers during the pandemic, New York has experienced robust corporate profits, soaring salaries, and stock market-driven capital gains for the well-off. These surging profits, salaries, and capital gains have swollen the state's personal and budget and business income tax collections. As a result, total tax collections for the current year are likely 15% higher than anticipated last April. For the first 9 months of the current 2022 fiscal year, tax collections were 25% higher than in the comparable pre-pandemic fiscal 2020 year. And tax revenues are continuing to roll in well above projections made as recently as November. As of a month ago, when the governor's proposed budget was released, tax collection projections were raised by $4.6 billion for this fiscal year and $19 billion over 4 years. Those extra dollars permitted Governor Hochul to lay out an ambitious agenda, combining several spending initiatives, tax cuts, and pay-as-you-go capital spending. Let's give Governor Hochul credit for proposing a budget far better than what we could have expected from her predecessor. For example, the fiscal 23 executive budget includes $1.2 billion for bonuses for frontline healthcare workers, intended to aid staff retention and recruitment. It also proposes $500 million to fund a 5.4% cost of living increase for contract workers in human services and mental hygiene agencies. By way of contrast, for most of his 10 years in office, her predecessor denied any pay increases for such nonprofit workers. As a down payment on our pledge to transform SUNY into the top statewide system of public higher education in the country, the governor's budget also increases higher education funding by over 9% in the coming year. This includes fully funding tuition credits provided to tuition assistance program recipients, TAP recipients, expanding TAP for part-time students enrolled in degree programs, and funding additional full-time faculty at CUNY and SUNY schools. The budget also includes tax cuts worth $2.2 billion for a one-time homeowner tax rebate and $1.2 billion to accelerate a middle-class tax cut that's being phased in. Now, do these initiatives do enough to heal our COVID-ravaged state? In a word, no. Here's the reality. Today, nearly 1 million households across the state have lost work and paychecks and have run out of federal help. Many now worry about paying the rent and possible eviction, while coping with COVID's health impact or the mental anguish of trying to juggle work and family responsibilities with what passes for a safety net in this society. And while the state has received $18.5 billion in federal pandemic assistance this fiscal year, 14 billion of that is in the form of programmatic assistance meant to address pandemic-related expenditures and needs, such as for emergency rental assistance or helping schools reopen. Direct federal income assistance to families has now dried up. Unfortunately, however, state budget documents don't suggest any urgency in using flexible federal resources to respond to the sky-high unemployment crisis. State forecasters now think that New York won't reach pre-pandemic employment levels until 2024. To address this crisis, my organization's recent state policy brief, I'll put the link in the chat, proposed an immediate active labor market program of job retraining and employment assistance. Anticipating that the legislature will have their own extensive set of budget priorities, Governor Hochul includes in a revised fiscal 2022 budget a $2 billion reserve for pandemic assistance that will be jointly negotiated with the legislature. Give the governor credit for being considerate of the legislature's priorities in a way that we've never seen before in a budget proposal. That's a good start, but it's not sufficiently responsive to the current crisis. The needs are far greater and the budget choices are clear, and they are at hand. Make smart use of the one-time federal COVID relief to repair the damage to the labor market so that more people can get back to work sooner and with better skills so that they can enhance their earning potential. This could be New York's version of Build Back Better. Provide assistance to those who were frozen out of federal economic assistance. Rethink feel-good tax relief that spreads small amounts of tax cuts among lots of people and target relief to those still struggling without work and low-income households that were bypassed by middle-class tax cuts. Look to large profitable corporations to help fund services that will benefit all New Yorkers, including their employees, like universal childcare. Extend the corporate tax surcharge that will expire next year and start seriously trimming unnecessary corporate tax breaks and subsidies that unlevel the playing field for small businesses. And New York needs to get serious about collecting unemployment payroll taxes from freeloading gig companies. Hundreds of thousands of gig workers were able to receive either state or federal unemployment benefits during the pandemic, but gig companies have avoided paying their share of payroll taxes to support those benefits. Finally, it is laudable and prudent for the governor to want to increase New York's budget reserves. They've been too low for too long. However, it's hard for me to believe that it is prudent to quadruple those reserves in one fell swoop, given the disinvestments that have occurred over the past decade in nearly every area of public services and human needs in New York. It should be sufficient to double reserves in this budget and consider adding reserves when we return to full employment and tax revenues increase further. You will hear about several essential budget priorities during the course of this Advocacy Day regarding worker well-being, healthcare, the safety net, housing, addressing the climate crisis, and restorative criminal justice. As I wrap up, let me return to the subject I know best, the state economy and our workforce. The Build Back Better bill in Washington would be path-breaking, in part because it would begin to make needed investments in raising the pay of care workers, that large and fast-growing segment of the economy where wages are largely determined by government itself. We're talking about home care workers, lower paid healthcare workers, nonprofit workers providing human services, and child care workers. This is a largely female workforce and disproportionately women of color. According to the state labor department's 10-year projections, care workers will account for over 1/3 of all new jobs in New York's economy over the next decade. But most of these workers are paid much less than similarly educated counterparts in the private economy. We all want and need Build Back Better to pass in Washington, but we can't and we shouldn't wait for that to happen. New York has the budget resources in hand and on a recurring basis, if we make the right choice, to take a giant. If we do, we will be making a smart investment in our people, in our economy, and in a more equitable future. Thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Peter.
Thank you, Dr. Parrott. You did not disappoint. That was tremendous. And I really appreciate your emphasis on addressing chronic unemployment within our state. I think we are somewhat under the illusion that that jobs are really coming back fast and that we don't have to worry about this so much. But I appreciate you redirecting our attention to this terrible jobs deficit. I would like to open it up here for questions from the audience. You can just raise your hand or put something in the chat. Okay, well, let me, while we're having people formulate questions, let me try one. So it seems as though there are better choices in terms of generating tax revenue for our state than giving a tax break to some big corporation. I think the theory there is that if you give a tax break at the top, that it's going to trickle down and benefit the rest of the economy. But I think what you're proposing really is that you're probably going to generate more tax revenue by investing in the bottom, and investing in the demand side of the economy. Could you say a little more about that?
Sure. We've long understood that investments in education help build a productive and a more effective economy, and that's better for everyone. That will not only generate tax revenues, but it will also reduce the need for public expenditures to help care for people who aren't able to make ends meet on their own. We now know, because of a lot of important research that's been done in recent years, that the value of education starts at birth, basically, and that significant investments in early childhood education, starting at a few weeks, is really important to enhance child development, that will enable children to do better at all levels in school, and consequently they'll graduate and be able to qualify for better paying, more demanding, more fulfilling jobs, and so on. So it's better for everyone. New York State faces the opportunity this year to make a serious commitment toward universal childcare, in a way that will not only expand the child development potential for for the youngest New Yorkers, but also improve quality and pay for childcare workers, and also, as Dr. English spoke about, enhance the ability of mothers to re-enter the labor force and to become productive members of the paid economy. They certainly do a lot of productive, valuable work in the home economy. So most other developed countries have long ago figured out that we need to address affordable, accessible, high quality childcare, and have engineered their governments and economies to provide that. We have the opportunity this year in New York to do that. It takes resources to do that. It's clearly in the interest of large companies in New York to help contribute to that through a modest payroll tax. Their own workers will benefit. Their productivity of their workforce will be enhanced, and the productivity of the broader economy will prosper as well.
Great. So now we've generated some activity in the chat. We have some great questions here. So Richard Gilbert asks us, what do you think about universal basic income as a state policy for reducing poverty?
Well, I think it's worth looking at that. I guess, if you think about all of the priorities that you'll hear about today, there are many of those. While I think if we manage the budget in a different way, and made some different choices along the way, having to do with the reserves and some of the tax cuts the governor's speaking about, as well as addressing some of the future further investments that are needed that corporations can help pay for, we can fund a lot of those. I'm not sure we can fund everything as extensively as is needed. There are some serious policy issues around universal basic income. We have a safety net that doesn't function nearly as well as it should, but sometimes universal basic income proposals contemplate and count on replacing the existing safety net support. So we would want to be careful to do that. So there are some interesting local universal basic income experiments going on around the country. I think we should pay attention to those. But I also think that we have a very full plate of priorities that need to be addressed right now, and we need to focus on how we can re-engineer our budget in order to make the investments to fulfill many of the agendas that we'll be talking about today.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to go in order. Ravi Ragbir, you just had a note in here about credits for further education. Did you want to expand on that question?
Yes, Peter, I'm just saying that during this moment in the pandemic, a lot of people have spent time to re-educate themselves. And if that has cost money, is there any way that those, we give credits to corporations, but why don't we give credits for people educating themselves, to get a better job or to be more skilled in that way? That's what I was thinking about. Does that make sense?
That is exactly the sort of thing that I had in mind in terms of the sort of workforce investments that the state needs to be making to respond to the current unemployment crisis. The economy has been turned upside down, literally, and twisted in so many ways. It's not the same economy we had 2 years ago. Our leaders need to recognize how much things have changed. We're not going to get back the same jobs we had before. We may be better because of that if we can help, people address what fulfill their aspirations, to get more education, to get training, to get a better job that has more career advancement opportunities, better earning opportunities. That's exactly the moment that we're in. And yet there's no proposal from the governor at this point on doing that on a large scale. She does talk about the need to do that in parts of the healthcare sector, and the need to do that to recruit new people to government employment, because a certain number of state and local government, New York City's government workforce is down quite a bit compared to what it was before the pandemic. We need to help people get additional education to better address the changing employer needs in this economy. Again, I look out there and I see far too much complacency about the labor market is just going to fix itself. It's only a matter of time. As an economist who's closely studied that, I don't believe it. I think it's not going to, when we sit back, as we have after past business cycle downturns, to let the economy, quote, heal itself, the result is years and years of double-digit unemployment that have a very racially disparate impact. We can't afford that. We don't need that. We know the labor market has changed, and we should be responding and helping people get more education. And that's what the federal funds were intended to do. We need to put them to that purpose.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, I think this is from you, Richard Kubek, about the prospects of a excluded workers fund in the budget, and what are the chances of that getting replenished in this budget to the tune of $3 billion?
Well, it was an historic achievement last year when New York State led the country in making a substantial commitment to the Excluded Workers Fund. And we saw how needed those resources were, because people lined up right away to apply for that, and the money soon ran out. I have an idea that's one of the things the governor had in mind when she set aside $2 billion in a line in the budget called Pandemic Economic Relief in this year's budget for the state legislature to allocate. I mean, it's unfortunate that she didn't want to own that sort of commitment herself, but there are resources there that can be built upon. So I would imagine that there will be a significant funding commitment in that area. Depends. There are lots of moving parts in the budget. It depends what else is happening on many other fronts to know whether or not that's going to get back to $3 billion. But I think it will get a lot of attention. It is getting a lot of attention.
Great. We're going to try to bleed a couple minutes past 10 so I can get to the remaining questions here. This is from Bob Elmendorf, what should be done with the so-called death tax, the estate tax. I worked on that when the New York worked on that with the New York State tax. And Bob said that he was for increasing it. Any thoughts on this? I think there's a federal and a state component to that, right, on the state tax?
Yes, there is. It's always good in many of these areas if the federal government were providing more leadership in that area. I mean, that's part of the reason why we've had, such polarization in the distribution of income and wealth is that we have inadequate tax policies at all levels. New York is fortunate that it still has an estate tax, which brings in pretty significant revenues. So, there's always a limit to how much New York can do above and beyond what other states do. But there's no question that it's been very beneficial in New York, and there are probably ways that it can be enhanced further. But I think a big step forward was made last year when the top tax rates on the personal income tax were increased. And at present, those are scheduled to continue through 2027. We will certainly need to have those renewed going forward. And because there hasn't been action at the federal level on on taxes more targeted toward a wealth tax, I think New York State should explore that further. And estate tax is a form of wealth tax. Property taxes are a form of wealth tax. I've been very involved in New York City in property tax reform. We issued some recommendations at the end of last calendar year about that. The legislature, it may not address those this year, but hopefully it will next year. Those proposed property tax reforms will go a long way to making the property tax less regressive in New York, and it will increase the share of the residential property tax burden paid by very high earners who own very expensive properties in New York City. So that's an area where New York State, because it has to be decided in Albany, can make significant headway toward taxing wealth, but it has to do that in the name of reforming property taxes in New York City. So that's a debate probably for next year, but it's an important part of a more equitable tax system statewide.
Okay. I'm going to quickly probably three more questions. Michael McGlynn, you have your hand up. A brief question.
Good morning and God bless. My question is basically about the Department of Labor's workforce investment boards. Do you think that they would get money from the federal and state budgets to force school districts to sponsor teacher aid and child care workers apprenticeships so that the individuals working in the school districts will have sufficient and adequate incomes as well as education and training so that they can assist the youth with their social and emotional learning skills?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So that's something I don't know if that would be something that would be proposed or carried out through the workforce investment boards, but it certainly should be a discussion I mean, it seems like in the governor's budget proposal, she was she proposed that there be an Office of Workforce Development statewide, housed in Empire State Development, intended to work through the regional economic development councils. So I mean, that's one way to sort of organize activities at a regional level to make sure that it's responsive to different regional and local needs around the state. But your underlying point about the need for greater investments to recognize the value of providing additional training and advancement opportunities for entry-level workers in the education system, that to me is a no-brainer. That's exactly the sort of investment that we should be making. That's exactly the sort of investment that the federal pandemic relief funds were intended to support, to help repair the labor market and to make it better than it was before. So we should certainly do that. I don't believe that that's on the agenda right now. It wasn't part of the governor's agenda, and I don't know that there have been legislative proposals on that. But you know, you heard what I said about this being the most challenging economy since the Great Depression. I mean, I've looked at the economy and the labor market closely, and you know, I didn't jump to that conclusion. That's just inescapable when you look at the numbers. So we need to be making significant investments to repair the economy, to give people opportunities to earn better, and to address, you know, what the changing education needs in the public school system are.
Yeah, I'm going to pose one question with apologies to the fact that we didn't get to everyone. We will try to circle back. We have it recorded in the chat, but I'm just going to give you one more, Dr. Parrott. How dependent is the New York economy on our brothers and sisters who come from other countries and do not have legal status? While the New York legislature cannot change federal law and immigration, we can make the state more unauthorized immigrant friendly. Do you have any comments on what New York can do in this regard? This comes from Sister Catherine Darcy.
Yeah, no. When we did our first estimates of what the likely labor market impact of COVID were, you know, we released our first analysis of this April 15th of 2020, and it was very clear early on that there was going to be a disproportionately negative impact on immigrant workers, and particularly lower paid, likely undocumented immigrants. And we tried to provide an estimate of that, you know, and found that over 200,000 undocumented workers were likely to be separated from their jobs and their income sources. And of course, it's very difficult for them to access public benefits. They pay a lot in taxes, of course, through the sales tax, through property taxes, and so on. And it's very hard for them to access the benefits that every other taxpayer receives. That's exactly the premise behind the Excluded Workers Fund. So that was a significant achievement last year. It's on the table again this year. Again, it looks like that will get funded to some extent. We certainly need to have better immigration policies at a national level. We need to establish a path toward legalization for a lot of undocumented workers. It's in everyone's interest to do that. We're not quite on the cusp of that at the federal level, but hopefully we'll get there before too long. That will also give us a more dynamic and robust economy, and it will help address, you know, the inevitable demographic changes that are taking place in this country with the aging of the baby boomer generation and so on. This country is going to have to revisit its immigration policies in a serious way before too long. New York has been one of the better states in that regard. And I think you'll continue to see that in this session.
Right. Well, thank you, Dr. Parrott. I couldn't resist one parting comment here from Ronnie Minter from the Freedom Unshackled Coalition, who reminds us that incarcerated men and women earn currently between 14 and 75 cents an hour. This is really just an insult and a huge problem, and really impairs their ability to be able to re-enter the workforce. Fast reaction.
Yeah, so that's a great issue. And in many respects, Governor Hochul is such a breath of fresh air and fresh thinking. She did propose in her budget to restore funding to enable incarcerated persons and formerly incarcerated persons to better access the benefits of higher education. New York State started that years and years ago, and then in the crush in the rush to have punitive criminal justice policies, that was taken away. So she is proposing to restore that. So that's a huge step in the right direction. I think she's capable of being encouraged to go further in that area. And I encourage you to work with her on that.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Parrott, for being so generous with your thoughts and your time here today. We're just so indebted to you, and for faith leaders to be able to talk to an economist to sort of make some sense out of what we deal with every day is just tremendous. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.